Microphone screeched when the regional manager tapped it, and the whole retirement hall went quiet. I stood up from the table, where I'd been sitting with a plate of untouched salmon and a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched either. And I walked to the front of the room, because that's what you do when 60 people are waiting for you to say something. My hands were steady. I'd spent 38 years in insurance, adjusting, assessing damage, calculating loss, keeping my hands steady while people crumpled in front of me. My hands were always steady. What I hadn't counted on was the Scotiabank envelope in my jacket pocket. 3 days before that retirement dinner, I'd been sitting at my kitchen table in Burlington, Ontario, drinking instant coffee. The cheap kind, the kind I'd been buying for years because it seemed foolish to spend $4 on a bag of beans when the instant was perfectly fine. And I'd scratched a lottery ticket with a dime and sat very still for a long time. $18,400,000. I read it 4 times. Then I got up, rinsed my coffee mug, dried it, put it back in the cupboard, and sat back down. The ticket sat on the table. The number didn't move. My name is Douglas Mercer. I was 64 years old. I had worked for the same insurance company in Burlington since I was 26. I owned a modest semi-detached on a street where all the houses looked like mine. Drove a 2017 Civic with 70,000 kilometers on it, and had one son, Ivan, who had not returned my calls in 11 years. The retirement dinner was 3 days after the ticket. I hadn't told anyone about the winnings yet. I wasn't sure I was going to. The OLG press conference changed that. Ontario law didn't force me to appear publicly, but they strongly encouraged it. And my financial advisor, a woman named Patricia Lamb, who I'd called the morning after the ticket, told me that appearing voluntarily with some control over the narrative was better than being tracked down by a journalist. I appeared. They photographed me with an oversized check. The CBC morning show ran a 40-second clip. My face was on 3 news websites by noon. My full name, my city, my face. $18,400,000. I drove home from the press conference and sat in my Civic in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. Patricia Lamb had already begun the trust structures. We'd spent 6 hours over 2 days in her Oakville office, her laying out what the tax situation looked like after federal and Ontario provincial deductions, what remained, how to protect it. She had a calm, methodical manner I appreciated. She didn't congratulate me more than once. She treated it like a logistics problem, which it was. "You'll want to be careful about who knows the full scope of this," she'd said, sliding a document across the table. "People change when numbers get large. Even people you know well." I thought about Yvonne then. I'd thought about Yvonne every day for 11 years, the way you think about a persistent ache. Automatically, without wanting to, just as a matter of habit. He was 37 now, if I calculated correctly. I usually didn't let myself calculate. After taxes and the trust structure, I had a little over $12 million available. Patricia helped me close on a house in Ancaster 3 weeks later. A proper house, 2 stories, a back garden that needed work, a street with mature trees. I paid cash. The realtor looked at me the same way people look at magicians. I drove home from signing the papers and made instant coffee and sat at the kitchen table in my new house, surrounded by boxes, and felt the particular quiet of a space that's never been yours before. I unpacked methodically, kitchen first, then bedroom, then the study, where I arranged my reference books alphabetically and set my desk near the window that faced the garden. Order helped. In 38 years of insurance adjusting, I'd walked into hundreds of damaged homes, assessed hundreds of situations that felt impossible to the people inside them. Order was how you started. You cataloged what remained. You worked from there. I'd been in the Ancaster house 9 days when the doorbell rang at 11 in the morning. I wasn't expecting anyone. Patricia Lamb had the address. My neighbor from Burlington had the address. No one else. I went to the front window and looked out. A car I didn't recognize sat in the driveway. A newer model SUV, Ontario plates. A man and a woman stood at the door. I couldn't see their faces fully from the angle, but something about the posture of the woman, the set of her shoulders, the way she stood with her weight slightly back, made my chest do something uncomfortable. I opened the door. Ivan looked like me from certain angles, always had. He was taller now than I remembered, which shouldn't have surprised me. He'd been 26 the last time I'd seen him. And his hairline had moved back some. The woman beside him was his wife, Carrie, whom I'd met exactly twice before the silence started. She had their daughter on her hip, a child I'd never met. 3 or 4 years old, dark-haired, watching me with the focused curiosity children have before they learn to be polite about staring. Dad. Ivan's voice was careful, like a person who'd rehearsed the word. We were in the area. Ancaster isn't on the way to anywhere from wherever you're coming from, I said. My voice came out level. I was proud of that. Carrie smiled. We saw the news. We just wanted to come by, and she looked at the house. See how you were doing? Settling in. I stood in the doorway. A man I'd spent 11 years practicing not missing stood on my porch with a child I hadn't known existed, and a story about being in the area, and behind their rented SUV, I could see that they packed bags visible through the rear window. I stepped aside and let them in. I don't know why, entirely. 38 years of assessing damage had taught me that the human capacity for hope is not rational, particularly parental hope, which survives things it has no business surviving. They came inside. I made tea. The little girl, her name was Rosie, climbed onto my sofa and began examining a coaster with the focused attention of someone doing important research. Evan sat across from me and said things about the drive, about Toronto traffic, about how the house was lovely, really lovely. Carrie said the garden had potential. They hadn't asked about the money yet. That would come. I'd spent 38 years learning to read people in the first 5 minutes of a conversation, what they'd come to say, what they were working toward. I knew what they were working toward. The last time Ivan and I had spoken, he was 26 and I'd just told him I couldn't co-sign a $90,000 business loan. He'd been talking about opening a restaurant in Mississauga, a specific location, a specific concept, had already been to the bank, had already chosen the kitchen equipment in his head. He needed a co-signer because he had no credit history worth mentioning, and the bank wouldn't move without one. I had $23,000 in savings. I was a single man supporting myself on a reasonable but not extravagant insurance adjuster's salary. Co-signing $90,000 with no savings cushion would have meant that if the restaurant failed, I'd be responsible for a debt that would take me the rest of my working life to address. I'd told him that, carefully, with full explanation. He'd told me that I'd never believed in him, that his mother's family had always been right about me, that some fathers actually supported their children, that he didn't want anything from me if this was what having a father meant. He'd left. He hadn't come back. I'd sent birthday cards for 2 years. None were acknowledged. After 2 years, I stopped, because continuing felt like something I was doing for myself rather than for him. Now he sat in my new living room in Ancaster, talking about the garden, and Rosie had fallen asleep on my sofa with the coaster in her hand, and Carrie was asking whether I needed help with the unpacking, and I was watching all of it with the same careful attention I'd given to flooded basements and fire-damaged kitchens for nearly 4 decades. That night, they stayed in the guest room. I hadn't offered it exactly. It had simply been assumed, the way certain things get assumed when people arrive with luggage visible through a rear window. I lay in my own bed and listened to the house settle and thought about what I knew about Ivan's current situation, which was very little. I'd stopped trying to gather information after the 3rd-year silence because that had also felt like something I was doing for myself. In the morning, I made oatmeal, and we ate together around the kitchen table, and Rosie ate mostly the raisins out of her bowl, and Ivan asked, casually, as though it had just occurred to him, whether I'd thought about what I was planning to do with everything. With my time, I said. He smiled. With the money, Dad. I've got a financial advisor working through the structures, I told him. It's being handled responsibly. Of course, he said. Of course, it's just. He looked at Carrie. We've had a difficult couple of years. Carrie's hours were cut. I had a business that didn't work out. We're managing, but it's been hard. He looked at his coffee cup. You're our family. That's all. I finished my oatmeal that afternoon while Ivan took Rosie to the park down the street. Carrie sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands folded and said, very directly, which I actually respected, "We owe $67,000 to two lenders and we're 4 months behind on the mortgage. We're going to lose the house if something doesn't change before spring." "I appreciate you being direct," I said. "We're not asking for charity." Ivan wanted to frame it differently, but I thought you should know the actual situation. "How long have you been in that position?" Carrie was quiet for a moment. "About 18 months. The business. Ivan had a catering company. Failed last year. We tried to manage it on one salary, but there was also a car loan and Rosie's daycare costs and the mortgage. The timeline was significant. 18 months of financial difficulty. The OLG press conference had been 22 days ago. "What was the business?" I asked. "Catering," she said. "Corporate events mostly. COVID was hard on it. He held on as long as he could." I nodded. That evening I called Patricia Lam from my study with the door closed. The next morning I drove to a law office in Hamilton I'd already researched. The estate planning lawyer's name was Kwame Osebansu, recommended by Patricia as thorough and unambiguous. I called him 3 days after the OLG press conference as a matter of practical preparation. He'd been waiting for me to complete the initial financial structures before we drafted the estate documents. We finalized everything that morning. My estate, including all trust assets, would be divided between the Hamilton Community Food Bank at 40%, the Canadian Veterans Advocacy Foundation at 40%, and a bursary fund for mature students re-entering post-secondary education at 20%. Ivan was named explicitly in the document. The language Osebansu had suggested. I acknowledge my son, Evan Mercer. I have given this matter full consideration. I direct my estate as stated above. This reflects my deliberate and considered choice. We discussed the legal standard for contesting in Ontario. It was narrow. Osebansu walked me through the case law. On my way back from Hamilton, I stopped at a coffee shop and sat with a proper coffee, the expensive kind, $4, French press, and wrote in a small notebook I'd started keeping. Dates, conversations, specific statements. What Ivan had said about money, what Carrie had confirmed about the timeline. The bags visible through the rear window the morning they arrived. Evidence was what stood up. I'd learned that in 38 years. They'd been at the house for 2 weeks when Ivan brought up the restaurant again, not the same one. A different concept, a different city, Kitchener this time, a space he'd already found, a lease he'd looked into. He'd done research. He had printed pages. "It's a different situation than before," he said, pushing the pages across the kitchen table. "I have actual experience now with the catering company. I understand the cost structures. I just need capital to start." "How much?" I asked. He paused. $150,000 to do it properly. I looked at the printed pages. The numbers were optimistic in the way that business projections by people who want the business to work are always optimistic. "Let me think about it," I said. His jaw tightened. "You said that when I was 26. I was 26 and I asked for help, and you said, 'Let me think about it,' and you thought about it until I stopped asking." His voice had gone flat and careful, the way voices go when anger is being managed. "I know you had reasons. I understand the cosign risk, but I came here because we're family, and family helps each other when it matters." "I hear you," I said. "Dad." His voice broke slightly on the word, just slightly. "You have $12 million. I need $150,000. That's 1%. One to give your son a real chance." "I hear you," I repeated. "Let me think." He pushed back from the table and left the room. I heard him and Carrie speaking quietly upstairs. Not the words, just the tone. I photographed the printed business pages he'd left on the table, then put them in my study drawer. 3 days later, Ivan found me in the study. He'd knocked, which I appreciated. He sat in the chair across from my desk, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking about how we could formalize things," he said. "If you were to put the money into a family trust," he'd been researching, clearly, with me as a co-trustee, "we could make decisions together. You'd still have full oversight, but it would be structured as a family asset, not just yours. Carrie and I could manage the day-to-day." I set down my pen. A co-trustee arrangement would give you decision-making authority over my assets. In partnership, he said quickly. Not instead of you. I spent 40 years assessing claims, Ivan. I know what co-trustee means in practice. His face closed slightly. Right. That evening, I called a private investigator, a woman named Bev Szymanski, who'd been recommended by Osei Bonsu for exactly this kind of situation. She had a flat voice and a detailed intake process. I gave her Ivan's full name, Carrie's, the approximate location. 2 weeks, she said. Sometimes 3. I'll be thorough. The waiting period was instructive. Rosie, who had no investment in any of this, remained herself, curious, indiscriminate in her affections, deeply committed to the coaster she claimed as hers on the first day. She followed me into the garden one morning, when I was figuring out what the previous owners had planted, and crouched beside me in the dirt, with complete seriousness, naming things. That's a worm. That's a worm. That's also a worm. Do you like worms? I told her I found them useful. She considered this. I like the roly ones, she said. Even watched us from the back door with an expression I couldn't read. The conversations about money continued in the background. Ivan and Carrie careful to vary the approach, sometimes direct, sometimes framed as planning. Twice as concerned for my well-being. You shouldn't have to manage all this alone. We could help. Each conversation I listened to fully and said I appreciated the thought and took notes afterward. On the 17th day, Bev Szymanski emailed a document of 41 pages. I read it in my study with the door locked. The catering company had failed not because of COVID primarily, though that had been a factor in the early losses. It had failed because of $34,000 in unreconciled vendor invoices and a tax filing that had been missed 2 years running. The Canada Revenue Agency had a collections action pending. The car loan was not $22,000 as Carrie had implied, but $31,000. The mortgage arrears were real, 4 months as Carrie had said. The $67,000 in other debts was accurate. The OOG press conference had aired 22 days before Ivan rang my doorbell. Bev had also found, through publicly accessible court records, a small claims judgment against Ivan from a former employee, a server who'd claimed unpaid wages of $1,800. The judgment had gone against him. He hadn't paid it. There was one more thing, a notation at the bottom of the document flagged separately. In the week before they'd driven to Ancaster, Ivan had called his mother's sister in Hamilton. The aunt had called back. The recorded summary of what was discussed, accessed through mutual contacts Bev had, involved my name, my winnings, and the phrase it would be stupid not to try. I sat with that for a while. Then I opened a new document, titled it Phase 2, and began to write. The Hamilton Winter Gala for the Canadian Veterans Advocacy Foundation happened on a Thursday in February. 400 people. Dinner, speeches, a silent auction. I'd been involved with the organization as a donor since the previous October, when the trust structures were finalized and I'd begun directing funds. I invited Ivan and Carrie. It means something to me to have family there, I said, which was true in a way they wouldn't have understood. They came dressed well. Ivan wore a navy suit. Carrie wore a green dress that suited her. They were good at events, social and warm, the kind of couple that makes a good impression in a room. Ivan shook hands with the Veterans Organization president and spoke knowledgeably about military culture. He'd done some reading, I suspected. Carrie charmed the table. Between the salad and the main course, I leaned over to Ivan and said, quietly, that I'd made a decision about the restaurant. His attention sharpened immediately. I'm going to support it, I said. His exhale was audible. Dad, conditionally, I said. There are terms. Of course, he said quickly. Whatever you need. I want an independent business assessment. A proper one, conducted by a firm I choose. If the numbers hold up, I'll contribute, not as a loan. As an investment in exchange for equity. And I want full financial transparency, your personal finances, the business plan, everything. Before any money moves, he was nodding before I'd finished the sentence. Yes, absolutely. Whatever you need. Carrie across the table was watching us. She'd caught enough of the conversation to know the direction. Her face had gone careful and pleased in equal measure. I'm also going to need us to talk about the CRA situation, I said. Ivan's expression shifted. The first genuine surprise I'd seen from him. He was quiet for a moment. You know about that. I said nothing. He rubbed the back of his neck. We were going to deal with it. Before I invest in a new business, the existing CRA matter gets resolved. I'll help with that cost, but it gets resolved properly, with filings and full payment, not a workaround. He nodded slowly. Okay. And the server, I said. Riley Kowalski. The judgment you didn't pay. His jaw tightened. I was going to. The judgment you didn't pay. His jaw tightened. I was going to. The judgment gets paid, I said. Before we discuss anything else, a man worked for you and you owe him money. That gets handled. Ivan looked at his plate for a moment. Then he looked at me. How do you know about all of this? I spent 38 years in insurance assessment, I said. I know how to gather information. He was quiet for the rest of the dinner, mostly. Not hostile, but thinking. I watched him think. 3 days later, he came to my study and knocked. Sat down. Said I was honest with Carrie about the full situation. The CRA thing, Riley's wages. She didn't know about the wages. She didn't know about the wages. That wasn't good. He looked tired. I think I've been running from consequences for a while. The whole reason we came here, he paused, wasn't just because you're family. I know, I said. I wanted to ask if you're angry. I consider the question seriously. I'm not angry. I'm careful. There's a difference. He nodded. Is there a way back from this? That depends on what you do next, I said. Not with me. With the CRA, with Riley Kowalski, with the business you say you want. Actions are what I can see. I can't see intentions. He left without saying much else. 2 weeks later, he sent me confirmation that Riley Kowalski had been paid in full, a money transfer receipt, a message from Riley himself acknowledging it and expressing surprise. A week after that, a letter from an accountant he'd hired, a reputable firm in Mississauga, confirming that the CRA back filings were underway and a payment arrangement had been established. I filed both documents in my study drawer. In March, I hired the business assessment firm. They spent 4 weeks on Yvonne's Kitchener concept. Their report came back in late April. Cautious optimism, contingent on specific cost controls, a particular staffing model, and a realistic timeline to break even of 22 months instead of the 14 he'd projected. I read the report twice. Then I called Osebonsu. The Veterans Gala in June was a different kind of evening than the February one. This one was outdoors, a fundraiser in Dundas Valley. 200 people, picnic tables, local food, kids running around on the grass. I'd been volunteering with the foundation for several months by then, helping with their employment transition program for veterans re-entering civilian work. It used skills I had, assessing situations, identifying gaps, connecting people to resources. It felt useful in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Ivan came with Rosie. Carrie was working a shift and couldn't make it. We sat at the picnic table with paper plates of grilled corn and smoked brisket. Rosie ate the corn methodically and with great focus. Ivan and I talked about the assessment report, the cost structures, the timeline. It was the first practical conversation we'd had that felt like two people working on a problem rather than one person pursuing and the other retreating. At some point he asked, "Do you think it can work? I think it depends on whether you're willing to operate within the numbers the assessors set, not the numbers you want to be true." I turned my corn over. Which is harder than it sounds. He nodded. I know. Rosie held up her cob. This is the best one, she said. This is the best one, she said. This is the best one, I agreed. Ivan smiled at his daughter. Then he looked at me. I'm sorry about how it ended before. 11 years ago. I meant the things I said and the way that you mean things when you're 26 and angry and humiliated, but that doesn't make them right. He looked at his plate. I cost us 11 years. I received this carefully, the way I received everything now. It sounded true. It might be true. Trust was a different structure than an apology. I knew this from 38 years of claims. I appreciate you saying that, I said. He nodded. Fair. We ate corn in the early summer evening while a veteran 50 feet away was explaining to his daughter how to identify the constellation Orion by pointing at a sky that wasn't dark enough yet to see it in. The father patient, the daughter skeptical. Both of them trying. In July, I met with Osei Bonsu to review what I had decided. The state documents remained as drafted. The Community Food Bank, the Veterans Foundation, the Bursary Fund. Evan's name remained in the document with the explicit clause. This was not a document I intended to revise based on one good season of behavior. Trust was built across time in conditions that varied. I'd spent 38 years learning that what I did revise was a separate document, a conditional investment agreement reviewed by Osei Bonsu, by Patricia Lam, and by an independent business law firm. Ivan would receive an investment of $110,000 toward the Kitchener restaurant. Not a gift. Not a loan. An investment with equity terms, reporting requirements, specific financial transparency clauses, and a clause specifying that any material misrepresentation would trigger immediate dissolution of the agreement and recovery of all principal. I also established separately a modest monthly transfer to a joint household account I'd set up for Ivan and Carrie's family, $2,800 per month, enough to relieve the worst of the mortgage pressure while the CRA arrangement completed. Time limited, 24 months, renewable based on demonstrated financial responsibility. Not the grand gesture they might have imagined when they drove to Ancaster with luggage visible through the rear window. Not a clean slate and a fresh start at my expense. Something more complicated and more honest than that. Support conditioned on accountability. Investment contingent on transparency. A relationship rebuilt on terms I'd set after gathering my own evidence. I thought about the instant coffee, the $4 bag I'd switched to after the winnings, the small pleasure of a better thing. It seemed like a small symbol of something I was still working out. I met Ivan at a coffee shop in Ancaster on a Wednesday morning in early August to give him the investment documents. The cafe was the kind with exposed brick and pour-over coffee and tables that rocked slightly on the uneven floor. We sat by the window. Summer light coming in at an angle. He read through the agreement carefully, which I'd asked him to do before signing. He took 20 minutes. I drank my coffee. When he looked up, his expression was hard to read. These terms are stricter than I expected. Yes, I said. The reporting requirements. Quarterly statements, full financial access. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the street. Then he looked back at me. Dad, if I sign this and I build something, if it actually works, is there a version of this where we're actually family again? Not because of the money, just family. I didn't answer immediately. I thought about Rosie and the coaster she'd kept. I thought about the son who'd been 26 and angry and had said things he'd spent 11 years not taking back, and the father who'd sent cards for 2 years and then stopped. I thought about what I knew and what I couldn't know. I think there's a version of that, I said. I can't tell you when. It depends on things neither of us can see yet. But I think it's possible. He nodded slowly. That's honest. It's the best I can do, I said. He picked up the pen and signed. I walked home along the main street, past the pharmacy, past the hardware store, past the woman walking a very old dog who moved with the dignity of a creature who had earned his pace. The summer felt solid around me, warm and specific. The kind of day that gets remembered mostly as feeling. My phone buzzed. Patricia Lam. Investment documents received. Everything looks properly structured. Good. And a text from the Veterans Foundation. Volunteer appreciation dinner next month. We hope you'll be there. I replied that I would. At home, I made coffee, sat on the back porch, looked at the garden. Things were growing that I hadn't planted. Wild volunteers coming up in the bed near the fence, which the man at the garden center told me was just what happened when you left soil undisturbed long enough. You found out what was already there. I had $12 million and one son I didn't fully trust, and a granddaughter who had very clear feelings about roly-poly bugs, and a volunteer schedule, and neighbors who'd brought a casserole during my first week, and a coffee shop where the woman at the counter had learned my order, and a study where I sat in the mornings with a notebook and wrote down what I knew and what I didn't, and tried to work honestly with the difference. $18,400,000, scratched off with a dime at a gas station on a Tuesday in October. It hadn't made me happy. I'd understood early enough that it wouldn't. It had made things clearer, the way a bright light makes a room clearer, illuminating not just the things you wanted to see, but the arrangement of everything. Rosie called me Grandpa Douglas now. She'd decided this herself, announced her one morning while I was making oatmeal, and I'd said that was fine, and she'd gone back to examining the coaster, and that had been that. Some things you didn't plan for. Some things arrived in a particular way that acceptable things arrived, quietly and without ceremony, because they were simply the next true thing in a series of true things. I finished my coffee. The garden was doing something small and persistent in the way gardens did when left mostly alone. I went inside to start dinner. People ask me sometimes whether I regret not just writing Ivan a check and being done with it. Closing the gap the easy way, buying back something that looked like family. I understand why they ask. $18 million is a number that makes restraint seem almost perverse. What kind of father holds back when he has that much, and his son has that little? But I spent 38 years assessing damage for a living, and the thing I learned, the thing I couldn't unlearn, is that throwing money at a damaged structure doesn't repair it. It hides the cracks until the weight becomes too much and everything comes down at once. I'd seen it happen in houses. I'd watched it happen in families. The check that solves the immediate crisis without addressing what caused it isn't generosity. It's delay. What Ivan and Carrie had built together over 11 years of my absence wasn't a life that needed funding. It was a pattern that needed interrupting. The failed catering company, the unpaid wages, the CRA filings that kept getting deferred, the debt that kept growing. None of that was going to change because I handed them $150,000 and looked the other way. It would have changed the number. They wouldn't have changed anything that mattered. I think about Riley Kowalski sometimes. The server even owed $1,800 to, a judgment sitting unpaid in a public record that even had apparently decided wasn't urgent. That detail told me more than any conversation we had. It told me what Ivan considered acceptable, what he was willing to let slide when there was no consequence pressing on him. Small things like that are never actually small. They're the whole story in miniature. When I required that the wages be paid before any other conversation could happen, Ivan looked at me like I'd introduced an entirely unexpected variable. And in a way I had. Because for a long time, I suspect, the consequences of his choices had been abstract. A judgment on paper, a debt on a statement. Numbers. What he hadn't expected was a father who'd done his homework, who knew about Riley Kowalski, who wasn't going to be managed. That's what I mean when I say intelligence isn't cleverness. Ivan is clever. He researched co-trustee arrangements. He prepared printed business pages. He knew how to frame a conversation. But intelligence, real, practical intelligence, is the willingness to look at yourself accurately, to see your own pattern and name it honestly. That took him longer. I don't know if he's fully there yet. I'm not sure any of us ever fully are. What I know is this. The morning Rosie climbed into the garden beside me and crouched in the dirt cataloging worms, she wasn't doing it for any reason. She wasn't performing or positioning or working toward anything. She was just there, curious, present, bringing exactly what she had. Children do that. They show you what genuine attention looks like before the world teaches them to be strategic about it. I want to be the kind of person who deserves that kind of straightforward company, someone whose choices, over time, create the conditions for trust rather than the conditions for calculation. That takes longer than a press conference. It takes longer than a signed agreement. It takes the kind of daily, undramatic consistency that doesn't make for a good story, but makes for an actual life. The lottery gave me resources. What I did with them was still entirely up to me. I'm 64 years old. I have a son I'm cautiously, carefully rebuilding something with. I have a granddaughter who has decided I am hers and who has very specific views about roly-poly bugs. I have a volunteer schedule and a coffee shop where someone knows my order and a garden that's growing things I didn't plant. That's not an ending. It's just where I am. And for now, that's enough.